up, sexy people? It is Dave, it is Duncan, back from Metal Epidemic for another album review. For this review, Duncan and I have been checking out the new release from French art rock band Klone. The band's new album, The Unseen, will be released on November 8th via Pelagic Records. Back on Pelagic. Returning with their 10th full-length album, The Unseen, French art rock band Klone are pushing their already sumptuous sound to dizzying, magisterial heights.
Oh, I love that. Magisterial out of fucking nowhere.
A whole new journey through a singular yet contrasting soundscape. The Unseen is an immersive, dreamlike experience that speaks to their significance of things that at first glance seem to lack it. Coming off the back of their phenomenal 2023 album Meanwhile, The Unseen is a masterpiece of both performance and production that sees Klone wearing their years of experience proudly on their sleeves. With every member and every instrument pushed to its expressive limit, The Unseen has a might and intensity to it that, while sometimes abrasive, simultaneously feels natural, coherent, and unified as the band move from motif and melody as one, guided as ever by the unmistakable voice and vision of Jan Ligner. With such an inimitable 25 years of music already behind them, it seems apt that The Unseen is also Klone's 10th full-length release. The album serves as a milestone that uses reflections on the past as a means of appreciating the beauty of the present, with the band employing their shared decades of creativity and collaboration to offer enlightening new perspectives on the here and now. Okay, so we reviewed the last album, Meanwhile.
Yeah, in a previous life, we did The Dreamer's Hideaway on the Opeth,
yeah,
which is our first introduction to Klone, to be fair.
That's true.
So,
Meanwhile was only last year.
I was a bit shocked at this because I assumed when the teaser single came out that we were talking about a next year album.
I thought so.
No, we were both wrong.
Oh.
Ignorant sluts is what the internet called us. So I wasn't expecting. Like they clearly have. They're either trying to get out of their record deal with Pelagic by trying to release as many albums as possible, or this are a band that never switches off.
This is their first album back with Pelagic.
Was the previous one not on Pelagic?
No, it was K-Scope they were on the previous release.
That's right.
Which they're saying this is album 10.
Yes.
But on our last review, I was like, Meanwhile, album number 7. And then when I read the press release, I was like, Album number 10? But when I had a look at the list of releases, I think they're counting, there's 2 live albums they did. I think they must be including those as...
I mean, they're albums.
Yeah, I suppose.
By the nature of a release of albums, so...
Yeah.
Sneaky. That's why I don't read press statements, Dave, right? Because they're designed to confuse. You do your review and you're like, what is this word? But yes, so they're back on Pelagic, which is a great fit. Them and like Pelagic and Klone is like 2 flavors that go insanely well together.
For sure. And we both highly enjoyed Meanwhile. I think they're a band that have been like slowly kind of shaping their sound since the Dreamer's Hideaway, really.
Yes.
But I kind of felt like Meanwhile was the first time that stylistically it all kind of tied together and felt consistent.
It was the first album, I think, where they were leaning almost exclusively into that kind of world-building sound they have shaped around the vocals and the melody, as opposed to trying to throw in like some of those heavier sounding riffs that were definitely still present on Dreamer's Hideaway or their stuff even before that, which had a more kind of aggro sound. It's interesting they're referring to themselves as art rock now. I think it's the first time I've heard that in relation to them. I don't necessarily think it's a bad description, although to me, listening to The Unseen, and we'll get to it, to me there's swaths here that feels like a kind of a more refined grunge than anything else. Like there are huge moments in here that remind me of some of the quieter moments or even the unplugged moments of a band like Alice in Chains
Mhm.
than, you know, bands that I would class as art rock, which
Yeah.
by its nature is designed to be obtrusive, angular, and open to interpretation.
Yeah.
There isn't really a whole lot here that I think, out lyrically, there is, but I don't think there's much musically here that I'm going, if I listen to this in a different angle, I'm going to get a different interpretation.
Yeah.
It's lush and beautiful, and that's kind of I think they've now cordoned off that,
Mhm.
which is really interesting because having seen them live,
Yeah.
they're the sort of band that generally I would say, no, just keep doing the heavy shit because you're really fucking good at it. But they're a band that have like grown and matured, as horrible as that word is to metal bands. They've grown and matured into their sound, and as a result, I think Klone is almost this. It's a kind of stamp of quality now. Like even if you don't like every song on the album, like you're gonna like the problem with this review, and both of us are gonna experience it, is it's very difficult to poke holes in their sound. Right? Even if you come to the end of it and say, this bit could have been a little bit more aggressive, or they could have leaned into a little bit more of a dynamic switch up. On its face value, it's very well written. It's incredibly well performed.
Yeah.
And guess what? The production is. So, like when you have that as your core,
Yeah.
it's down to nitpick time, of which we are going to have to do when we review. So that's my opening statement, ladies and gentlemen of the jury.
Well, let's do that. So, it's worth mentioning also, this runs a touch shorter than the previous album. We've got 7 tracks, a runtime of about 42 minutes.
Yeah,
so,
like almost a quarter of that is the closing track.
Yes, that is true. But still, we've shaved a few tracks off and reduced the overall runtime is reduced by about 11 minutes compared to the previous album. So let's nitpick. What did you think of the Unseen? What did you make of the album as a whole?
So I think on the previous review, I had said that album to me sounded like an auditorium album.
Yeah.
Like I was like, I don't want to be standing. Well, one, I don't want to be standing at gigs. Well, no, right?
Fuck that.
But like to me, it felt like a full on, like a big amphitheater or an auditorium, some nice seats, and you sit down and you just watch this band perform and just take in the majesty and appreciate the sound. That's how I pictured this, and it's kind of interesting because there's a lot of instrumentation on this that kind of almost feels like it's inspired from. Wait 1 second. The auditorium tour that they played a lot more venues which were kind of more theatre based on that last tour.
Yeah.
I
did like a whole unplugged thing, did they not?
They a whole unplugged. So I get the feeling that they've kind of that seeped its way into the sound in a good way, because this one once again feels like I want to see this in a big venue, but I want to be seated, and like always seated. That's what I want. So I kind of feel like they've leaned into that. There's so much. I mean, from I think it's maybe an alto sax that comes in an interlaced open track, but there's strings, rich instrumentation. There might be a clarinet in there somewhere. Like it's just as a they're using instruments out with their core. And they're using them really well for the best thing to add and lift and expand out their sound. So that's like that was a thing I mentioned before, which is now very kind of pertinent and prevalent on this release. It's like that's carried over in leaps and bounds and been added to. So they've grown their sound from the previous album in some respects when it comes to their songwriting, right? The other thing I mentioned on the previous one was the lack of the more not even aggressive but harsh sounds that they had employed in previous albums. Even if it was on one song, there was a depth of it on the previous album. That's carried through here, right? So I almost at the stage I'm like, Klone has kind of outgrown that sound, and that's fine, right? They've decided this is our new sound, or this is the sound we've grown into, and that's cool. So I'm not even going to use as an argument on here what I used in the previous one, Because if they come back and there was like 2 or 3 sections where they were doing the more aggressive kind of Frenchy style metal vocal, and heavier sections would be like, they could have done it all along. Yeah, I'm not going to do that. So let's park that as well and just like take Klone on face value of this is a follow up to the previous album, which I really rather liked. Right. The first thing here is like, is there been ever a more confident Klone album? Like every single song just felt like they know their sound, they know their groove. It comes as there's a double-edgedness with that will come to on the things that maybe don't work as well for me, but it just sounds like every single track here is just this is Klone. This is what you should expect. It's huge. The guitars like are clean through the verse, and like there's something a little bit more distorted on the chorus sometimes. Interludes are sprawling, and they're all centered around, we mentioned it, the PR mentioned it, around those vocals. In a similar way, actually, to kind of that more unplugged and even later day Alice in Chains, which had that vibe as well, where they fully understood that actually, like, the vocals on an Alice in Chains album is actually what made them stand out more. It's why Jerry Cantrell's solo stuff is fine. Yeah. It's why later day Alice in Chains stuff is fine, but it's not as good as that kind of core sound that they had, which was all designed around the vocalist who had a very unique way of delivering vocals. Klone are kind of there as well. I think about it tonally. I've heard him do his more aggressive stuff, and it did sound like a more melodic Gojira. Like, having seen them on tour with Gojira, that's probably coloured that. But why he would want to do that when he can sing like this? His command of his vocals are incredible. Yeah. Like he'll hold a note and just like play with it for a while, and it sounds beautiful and lush. It's like all the way through. It's just like, this is the artwork colours that they have are kind of is like blues, dark blues, but they have like shades of yellow and kind of gold and all the rest. And I'm listening, and I'm like, I'm just getting all this, like, I'm getting all this colour listening to what he's doing. Musically, I think it's very well composed, right? So I think the guitar work is very well written. I think the drummer is having the best time of his life. Not slumming it, that sounds harsh, but he's not stretching himself near what he did before. But actually, he's playing exactly what he needs to do. I think the bass is nice and fresh and crisp. It's not doing much uniquely that would make it stand out. So once again, it's an album that is kind of focused on the melody, and you kind of lean into that and follow it through. I think they're kind of smart in a lot of respects in that they've kept the song lengths around the 5.5 minute marks for the majority of the runtime. Once again, the closing song, touch on that at the end, is the kind of exception to the rule. But it's a formula, and they adhere to that formula rigidly throughout this entire album. I think it's produced immaculately. You eat your fucking dinner off the production on this album. I love it. It's maybe not as kind of hugely roomy as the previous album, but I think for the style they've adopted on this one, it fits perfectly. I can hear everything nice and clear, listen to it through the good headphones, and just really, it's a handsome sounding album, right, from start to finish. Let's get on the nitpicks, right? There is no daring moment here, right? So I think, and I'm not saying they have to do something heavier, but I think even dynamically it sits in a comfort zone and doesn't really challenge itself, which is surprising because the band can go lighter or heavier, and they've done that in the past, which have added that kind of levels of that kind of dynamic creation and expression throughout the music, which to me is kind of one of the reasons I go back to Klone quite a lot. I think the teeter on and tease on moments that could go heavier but don't pull the trigger, which I'm not going to hold as a big negative because this is now their sound. But I also do feel similar to when we were talking about that Leprous album, that there's a missed opportunity here where the band could have maybe pushed themselves a little bit more, tried something. You've got like orchestra instruments here. You've got woodwind sections, you've got strings and all the rest. And I kind of feel even when they're employed out with the saxophone on interlaced, I'm sure it's a sax, which is really interesting and works really well. I've heard that done on a lot of albums in the last 2 years now, so I'm kind of like, it would be interesting if it did something else. And I kind of feel like there's a missed trick there as well, very similar to how I felt about the Leprous album, where I kind of got through it and I was like, I hear it, I like it, but I don't love it. Closing song's an interesting one, right? Because it runs 12 minutes plus. We have already reviewed this year an album from Sugar Horse where the closing track is ridiculously long, and to be honest, it's mostly one long. Remove the 4 minutes off it, it's about 20 minutes of existential, like body hovering, right? It's like you're being zapped into an alternative reality. Spring, weirdly, I feel is far too long. Like I kind of feel like there's an idea and a concept for it, which, and I'm going to stress this one, with some cool visuals in the background, live, like a screen playing things and whatnot, would work really well for me. In a listening environment, I'd went through an album which was relatively similar paced between songs into a final song which was about the same pace, and an elongated section at the end which kind of didn't add any value. So when I got to the end of it, I was like, So those are my negatives.
Yeah.
So ultimately what I'm left with is an album that is enjoyable to listen to, but at the same time frustrating because I am someone that knows the band's back catalogue, of which I thought we didn't count live albums, but the PR's telling us that we should. So I think the balance they had on the previous album was better. Even though it didn't take any huge risks, I felt the small changes that were employed there made the album more memorable. I've listened to this 3 times, and I'll be honest, songs tend to bleed into each other really well, to the point that out with the tracks that have a string section or an instrument uncommon to the Klone sound are the moments that are memorable, whereas I should be more on the choruses, the composition and all the rest, which I'm not saying are forgettable, but I think they're kind of lost. The Unseen to me feels like a very, very safe album. And given that it is a year on from the previous one, I think they might have rushed it. I think this is one of those, you come out of doing something, come out of doing a live tour, and you have a vibe in your head and you write an album of that vibe. And to me, the vibe, it's not even that it's not the Klone that I want. I like the previous album a lot more than this, but I feel that there's a I don't know if the band are very comfortable in their sound, and that comfort I think has led to complacency maybe in the songwriting. To me, there's just too much of stuff that feels like other tracks on here, whereas if I go back to the Dreamer's Hideaway, removing the heavier elements that are on that, like I can remember like full sections of riffs, I can remember choruses and all the rest, where there's nothing it's all very well done, but none of it stands out. It's a great album as background noise, which is a horrible thing to say to any band, but I could shove it on. I would not be upset listening to this at all. Yeah. But at the same time, the band can do better. Yeah, as my overriding feeling. I would be lying if I said I wasn't a little bit disappointed by this release. Yeah. What about you? How did you? Because you, like me, kind of went into the last. In fact, I think you might have been even more critical than I on the previous album about like we could have something a little bit heavier here, guys. You're kind of you are setting it up for a wee drop, and you're not doing it. And Big Davey is no pleased. How did you get on with the Unseen?
I'm wondering now if like some of the material or a lot of the material on this album might have been written at the same time
on the previous one for the turnaround. Possibly.
and it's maybe been stuff they've had left over they didn't want to use, and then they've maybe reworked it for this release. I don't know. It does seem quite a quick turnaround, and again, this one is only 7 tracks, so it's a bit shorter. Maybe it's stuff they had left over. I don't know. I feel like this to me feels more of them kind of embracing that they're now kind of lighter, more majestic sound on this release. As we said, Meanwhile wasn't a heavy album. It had little touches of heaviness. This album has probably even less of that.
I can only think of one section where things start to get a little bit heavier, and I think that's it in the entire album.
Yeah. This is not like a riff based album. Like there wasn't a moment where I was like, oh, what a riff. You know what I mean? There was nothing that never happened. As you said, there's like one moment where it gets a touch more distorted in the guitars. It's not like hugely heavy, but I think for the most part, the Unseen kind of saunters along, sitting in a very similar tempo. And the band,
good word. That's a really good word for it, to be honest.
And the band kind of weaving in and out of kind of light kind of prog verses. I mean, I can see how they're tagging on that kind of art thing. Maybe a wee bit jazzy at times, maybe slightly arty possibly, but and then the choruses, pick up a bit more and a bit more grand and a bit more kind of soaring sounding. And again, like that last album, it's very polished sounding. The songwriting is very refined, and the album does flow extremely well. Unlike Meanwhile, this album didn't take me long to kind of fully decipher it. Like Meanwhile took me about 3-4 listens to get it. This one was much more instant. Like I knew what I was getting on this one. And there wasn't anything on it that kind of hit me from left field, or I was like, oh, wait a minute, that's different. Or like, I never felt really surprised on this album. But I don't think this album is about like big musical or stylistic changes. It feels like just the band adding another kind of coat of like elegance to their sound. It's very slick. And like Meanwhile, it's very, very swoony.
You can't imagine like a producer, like the Klone are a producer's band.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, you know what I mean? If you're up, you are having, like you're in your best life. You know what I mean? You're sitting there, you're just like you're. Because I get the feeling that this is a band that comes in with fully formed songs.
Oh yeah.
All the time, and you've the easiest day.
Yeah.
That label's paying you to sit there and go, play guys, regale me with your songs, and then what's that? A saxophonist is coming in. Why not? Let's have fun with it.
Yeah. I think even though it is, it's very swoony. I didn't feel it was quite as immersive as Meanwhile. I felt with that album like I got quite lost in it. Which is maybe why it took me a few listens to kind of fully digest it. But with this one, it felt more succinct in a lot of the arrangements. A track like Magnetic, for example, felt a lot more kind of orthodox. It's like quite a short run time, like almost kind of like single length. It didn't meander into some of those more expansive waters that they sat in on Meanwhile. And the closing track was the only one that maybe just went a little bit further, in that kind of expansive sound. But it's the same, like if you listen to the time signatures on this, there's not much that sits out with a 4/4 time signature. Yeah. Rhythmically, okay, sometimes it goes a little bit more kind of choppy in the rhythm, and I think it was a title track. There was like a wee 6/8 thing on the title track, but for the most part, it's very straight, very flowing, and it works really well. I actually quite liked when they simplified it even more. I think it was Desire Line. Where
Desire Line it's probably the most memorable chorus on the entire album. I really hammer it back.
I dug the kind of feel of that track. It's got a kind of like waltzy kind of feel to it. And then as it went on, I was like, this is kind of like almost sitting like an old jazz club kind of vibe. Like when that sax kicks in. I really like the kind of tone and the atmosphere of that track. And the band I think sounded their best on it. They're just really locked in, really tight, but there's a lot of nuance in it as well. The drumming on Desire Line for me, I thought was just fucking awesome. Like Morgan, the drummer, there's lots of really nice little kind of ghost notes and little kind of intricacies that like, really kind of bring that track more to life. But like the musicianship is very strong across the board. Like these guys have been playing over 20 years now.
Oh yeah.
And you can hear on each album that kind of unity of the band just gets stronger and stronger. I think the bassist and the drummer, I'm sure Enzo and Morgan are the kind of the newest members of the band, but they've still been there for like 5-6 years.
Yeah.
And I feel like those two members do bring more of a finesse to these newer albums. But even Jan as a vocalist, I think his vocal just sounds even more confident on every release. His range is just incredible. His tone is really nice to sit and kind of listen and just kind of wander around. It's just like
there's a hint of grit in there.
Yeah,
I think that's like there's life behind that vocal,
Yeah.
and that's what makes me. If it was not that I want to keep bashing on Leprous, like that's too clean.
Yeah.
For what it's trying to do, you know what I mean? It's too clean, but it's trying to be something on that side. And this one here, like the music can all be clean, but there's something lived in with that voice.
Yeah.
And as a result, it engages you a lot more.
For sure. Like, I mean, even though the heavier style vocal is pretty much gone from this album, his clean tone, is incredible. And I think, like as you said, there's only I think one moment on the album where it gets slightly heavier and his vocal gets a touch heavier. I think it's a title track. But I didn't mind that. I think his voice is interesting enough to sit within that clean tone and not get bored of it. On tracks like Magnetic or Slow Down, it feels like he is kind of like painting a picture. Like it's very thoughtful, very kind of reflective. And the closing track kind of gets more into that, where it's it gets a bit more expansive. That's like the kind of 12+ minute Odyssey. It's got a lot of nice like harmonies and really cool dynamics on that track. Yeah, I agree it is a bit long, but there's elements of it that I do like. Yeah, I do. I feel like this is another really like well put together album from Klone. They have kind of found like this feels like maybe this is their niche now, and they're really kind of submerged themselves in it. I do know what you mean. This is, I don't want to say safe, but yeah, there isn't anything on here that I was kind of surprised by at all.
It's difficult when you know their back catalog. That's what I'm saying. Like when you know where a band has come from. Not that I'm saying a band can't change. I adore change in a band, but I do kind of feel like it feels comfortable. There's something about the comfort level of the album where I kind of feel, and it's the first one back on Pelagic, which they're a great home. I mean, it's a great label for them because they sit comfortably without sounding like any other band on Pelagic. But there is a bit where, like, especially with the fact that this is why I don't read the PR statements. They're talking about a celebration of 20 years as a band, and I don't know how much of that I get on this album. Yeah. As a celebration, if this is what we sound like 20 years into our career, kind of get that. But if we're celebrating the lineage of those albums, what I get here is a very well put together yet, and I don't want to say like completely forgettable, but I would say 80% of this album was like I'm struggling to, having listened to it 3 times this week. I'm struggling to, out with Desire Line, which that, like, because they keep coming back to Desire Line. It's a beautiful chorus. I'm kind of struggling to, like, can you remember any choruses from this?
Yeah. I maybe found it slightly more memorable than you, maybe. I agree that the hooks maybe aren't as big on this as Meanwhile, but I found this one much easier to get into. So maybe like newer fans or people that have never heard Klone before might find this like an easy kind of point to get into the band. It's quite it's accessible to an extent. It's still, there's still elements of prog to this, but it's not in a like like ambling or muso kind of type of way. It's quite subtly done overall. Production I feel also fits really well. I think the sound on Meanwhile was huge. Like it was very grand, and it worked really well with those songs. Whereas this maybe isn't quite as imposing. So, and I feel like the production kind of fits that. It's a little bit more delicate than the previous album, which I think fits this one a bit better. So scores. What would you score the Unseen from?
So, like I said, like
what are you thinking?
this is where the interesting part comes in, because like things I would generally mark an album down for are actually fucking tickety boo on this one here. It's recorded really well. It's played very well. It's a very handsome sounding record. To me, I think 3.5 is where I'm coming in on this one.
Okay.
I just find it less memorable than anything that Klone has put out before, and I also think the band can be and maybe should be a little bit more daring than they are on the releases moving forward, because they can do it whilst incorporating it fully into their sound, because they have done it before. I'm not saying retread old ground, but safe is a word that keeps popping in my head when I think of this one. It feels like a very safe release,
right?
Which you're on a new record label, you're moving forward, you've got many years under your belt. I kind of feel like you could have done something a little bit more challenging.
Okay.
So 3.5.
I think I'm going to come in marginally higher. And I think my reasoning for that would be I scored the Leprous album a 3.5. And I had a lot of similar gripes with that album, and it's very from a band point of view, the musicianship, it was quite a safe album. Vocally, it was, that was the kind of key focus on that album. I feel like I enjoy this one more than the Leprous album though. And yeah, I agree, a lot of this is quite in a comfort zone, but I do feel like I could put this on and just kind of have it on in the background and quite enjoy just sitting kind of listening to it. It's not a taxing album to listen to.
It's not at all.
I didn't get to the end and be like, oh my God, I'm exhausted. You know what I mean? I didn't get that at all. It's quite relaxing. It's quite chilled. The sax stuff, I never even mentioned the sax, but the sax stuff's fucking awesome on this album.
It's like when it comes in, you're just like that, just hire a saxophonist for every single song.
Yeah, and I think
should be in your band. Like,
I think you're right. The guy who does the sax also does keys, samples, and a wind MIDI controller.
Yeah.
So if that might be like clarinet or something like that, possibly.
There was a sound that was very reminiscent of clarinet on it.
Yeah, could be. So I think I'm going to go 4 out of 5. Not quite as high as Meanwhile. I think that is still a better album with bigger moments on it. But there is something still enjoyable about this. Not my favourite Klone release overall, but they're very good at what they do. It's hard to kind of
incredibly hard to pick holes in their sound because they're very good at it.
So I'm interested to hear people's thoughts on this one. So let us know. Have a listen to the album. I'll put links.
How wrong am I? Let us know.
Or how right are you? I mean, this one might go that. I don't know.
I have no clue.
I don't know either. Links below. Check it out. Have a listen. See what you think. The album comes out on the 8th of November on Pelagic Records. That's the review. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another review very soon. But until then, take care. Speak to you soon.
Bye, everyone.